You're very welcome, and thank you very much for joining me today. We're being told that a tsunami of evictions are coming down the line, and indeed over the last couple of years we've seen a number of high-profile evictions that were rather reminiscent of the 19th century. One lady who campaigned against evictions throughout the end of the 19th century, Anna Parnell, has largely been written out of history. And here to chat to me today is Lucy Keaveney, who's going to tell us a little bit more about this amazing lady. Lucy, you're very welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Anna.
So,
now, yes, go on.
I was going to say to you, Lucy, perhaps you might begin by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you came to be interested in the life of Anna Parnell.
Okay, I'm a retired teacher, and when I retired, I was looking around for different things to get involved in, because with teaching and having a family, my time was never really my own. So once I retired, my life took a different turn. I did equality studies in UCD, which I found very challenging, which I really enjoyed. And I would say probably I'm more an activist than I am an academic, in terms of I prefer to do things rather than talk about doing things. In 2011, we went to the Parnell School in Avondale. We went that year, both John, my husband, and myself. We went because the week actually was a feminist week. It dealt with a whole lot of feminist issues throughout the week. And I was drawn to it for that reason. But during the course of that week, I heard the story of Anna Parnell, and I was gripped by it. Basically, Anna was the leader of the Ladies' Land League in Ireland. The Ladies' Land League was set up to replace the men. Well, they had actually established themselves before the men were put into prison. But when the men were put in prison in the Land League, the women were ready to take over. And my goodness, how did they take over? They actually implemented the policies that the men failed to do. They had, would you believe, prior to social media, prior to mobile phones, they had a list of all the properties around Ireland, all the landlords, the size of the properties, the size of the families that were renting the properties, the absent landlords, and they had that at their fingertips when they took over. They had branches in England, in Scotland, right around in America. They were an amazing group of women.
Isn't that simply amazing? And
I was fascinated by it.
Yes, when you say, Lucy, that the men were in prison, of course, we're talking about Anna's brother, Charles Stewart Parnell.
Charles Stewart, yes, yes.
And Michael Davitt.
And Michael, yes, yes. They were actually went around to people. They would know from their inventories and from everything that they had, they would have a good idea what families were to be evicted, and they went and stayed with those families to prevent the eviction. If they failed, they built little, what would I call, kind of little bohons for the families to live in. They held meetings right around the country. And of course, this didn't suit the establishments, and their meetings were raided. So they came up with the idea that they would hold all their meetings at the one time. And that's what they did. And the English didn't have the personnel to police all the meetings, so they got away with their meetings that way. They were condemned by the church, but every time they were condemned, it led to a swell of numbers in the Ladies' Land League. They also, would you believe, provided food for the men in the prison. And when the men were put into prison, they were political prisoners. When the women were put into prison, they were there as prostitutes. They actually were so successful that it was it was easier for the authorities to deal with the men, and consequently an agreement was come to, and the men were released, including Charles Stewart. What they proceeded to do then marked the end of the Ladies' Land League.
Tell me a little bit about that, Lucy. How did the Ladies' Land League come to an end?
It came to an end once Charles Stewart came out. He said he would leave the Land League unless the Ladies' Land League was wound up. So their account was frozen, and that effectively, they held their money in a bank in Paris, and they ran on an overdraft, which the bank weren't too pleased with, but they were afraid always that the money that they had would be seized. So once that account was frozen, they just faded, and that was the end. The men took over. Anna eventually left Ireland. Her sister Fanny, that she was very close to, died. That really had it hit Anna very hard. She eventually went to England, and she changed her name to Cerise Palmer. She spent time in London. Now, she did come back to Ireland from time to time, and the one person that would be the real, give you the historic side to Anna would be Dr. Margaret Ward, who was one of the first feminist historians to write about Anna. She eventually ended up in Ilfracombe, which is in Devon, and she went out one day. She was a strong, very, very strong swimmer. But on the 20th of September in 1911, she went for a swim. She was advised that day not to go because the sea was very choppy. But Anna was headstrong, and she went for her swim. She got into difficulties. Now, the lifeboat and all at the baths in Ilfracombe, they went to extraordinary lengths to save her and then to revive her. But after an hour, they had to certify that she was dead. That happened on a Monday or a Tuesday, I'm not sure which, but her autopsy was held on a Thursday. And between her death and the autopsy being held, they discovered that she wasn't Cerise Palmer. She was actually Anna Parnell. Right. And they had to decide whether they'd hold the autopsy for Cerise Palmer or Anna Parnell. And they decided in the end to have the autopsy for Anna Parnell. So she was eventually buried in the graveyard in Ilfracombe. And there were 7 people at her funeral. Her landlady, the landlady's sister, and the men at the baths who tried to save her, and the parson who buried her. There was none of her family were at it, even though her sister did eventually put up a headstone for her. So in 1992, the Parnell Society visited her grave, and they erected a plaque on her grave. And from 1992 till 2013, it just deteriorated. After we heard her story in 2011, my husband and I decided that the first opportunity we got, we would go. So 2013, we went to London to watch the Irish women's soccer play. And then we drove from London to Ilfracombe. It is some journey. And we spent hours, about 3 hours, well, my husband mainly spent 3 hours looking for the grave. And eventually he found it. And it was in a really, really bad state. The headstone was tilted backwards. The graveyard itself was completely overgrown, as was Anna's grave, covered in weeds. It was sad, so very sad to see it in the state that it was in. So having the car, we were able to go to a local garden centre, and we got gravel and some plants and a spade, of course, to work on the grave. And after about an hour and a half to 2 hours, we rendered the grave as we did it as best we could. And we both had a very emotional moment at her grave that particular day, when I thought of just the 7 people at her funeral and how neglected she was for all of that period of time.
Yes. Oh, and you know how we have glorified her brother Charles Stewart Parnell.
It absolutely annoys me. It annoys me that the focus is on Charles. And I was through primary school, through secondary school, through college, and I did history in college, never heard a word about the Ladies' Land League or Anna's role, or even Fanny, who was an activist as well and died very young. And of course, Delia, her mother, who would have been a big influence on all of the family, even on Charles Stewart. But we tended her grave then every year. And I never actually thought that anything would come of it. In actual fact, the very first picture we took of the grave had the spade in the middle of the grave. Now, if we had intended getting publicity or going further with it, we would certainly have taken the spade away. So we had no plans to do anything. Everything that happened after that was purely by chance. By chance, I met Jimmy Deenahan at a centenary of the Kavanagh in 2016 in Glasnevin. And I would have co-founder of the Countess Markievicz School. And I went to Jimmy to look for funds for the Countess Markievicz School because we were always strapped for cash. And as I was talking to him, I talked to him about the 2 graves we had visited in England, Eva Gore Booth's and Anna Parnell's. And he said he would do up both graves. So that was pure chance, as it turned out. He did up, he renovated Eva Gore Booth's grave in Hampstead in London. And we had a ceremony to mark that same year with Dan Mulhall and officials from the embassy in London and officials from the Department of Foreign Affairs here in Dublin.
Now, can I interrupt you there, Lucy? Some people may not know who Jimmy Deenahan is. Of course, he was Minister Jimmy Deenahan, and I can't recall exactly which ministerial portfolio.
He was Minister for Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht.
Yes. Okay.
And a lovely man to deal with.
Yes.
A lovely man to deal with. Unfortunately, poor Jimmy didn't get re-elected, and we were back to the drawing board again. Having seen Eva Gore Booth's grave being done, it became important for us then to have Anna's grave done. So at a wreath-laying ceremony in Glasnevin, again, you see, I spend my time in graves, but anyway, at a wreath-laying ceremony, I made contact with Mary Mitchell O'Connor, who put Anna's case to the Minister for Arts, Heritage and the Gaeltacht, and through her we got the funding to do up Anna's grave. Right. And that was done in 2016. And it turned out that they made a beautiful job of it. So then we decided that we would go and have a ceremony at her grave. So in 2018, there was a similar ceremony that, like what we had in Hampstead. We did the same with Anna in Ilfracombe. Mr. Adrian O'Neill, who was the Irish ambassador at the time, came down from London. Helen Dunlop O'Malley was over representing the Women's Council. We laid 4 wreaths on the grave. There was a beautiful ceremony. The ambassador gave a beautiful sermon, addressed the crowd and talked about how the equality issues that she fought for and her activism and the activism of the Ladies' Land League. Helen Dunlop O'Malley laid a wreath on behalf of the National Women's Council. We laid a wreath on behalf of the Women of Ireland, and the Countess Markievicz School laid a wreath. So there were 4 wreaths in all placed at the grave.
Lucy,
from there, sorry?
Sorry for interrupting you. Lucy, if you could bring us up to date now, you were recently involved in the unveiling of a plaque here in Dublin to commemorate Anna.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. An unveiling of a plaque for Countess Markievicz in Dublin, we decided then that really Anna needed to have a plaque as well. And I contacted Brendan Teeling from Dublin City Council, and he went along with it. He thought it was a great idea. Obviously, the coronavirus prevented it happening for the best part of 16 months. But on the 20th of September, which is the anniversary of Anna's death, we unveiled a plaque to her at the Allied Irish Bank, which is at the top of O'Connell Street. And that was the headquarters of the Ladies' Land League. And it was a very proud moment. I'm absolutely delighted. Now, Anna, in terms of Anna's activism, and she is such a figure in Irish life that she deserves at this stage to be repatriated, to have her body repatriated. Dr. Margaret Ward referred to that at the Anna Parnell lecture in 2018. She said that Ilfracombe had minded her for long enough, and it was time now to bring her home. She was a driving force and a staunch activist on the part of the poor, and as founder of the Ladies' Land League. Her memory must be cultivated, and the government should actually do something now to revive her historical legacy. They have renovated her grave in Ilfracombe. It's time now to bring her home. And if I can quote from Anna, at a meeting of the Land League in March 1881, Anna acknowledged that her actions would never be appreciated in her lifetime, but she hoped that, and I quote, "Perhaps when we are dead and gone and another generation grown up, they will point to us as having set a noble example to all the women of Ireland." And that quote comes from Manona Hearn by Nicola Depuy. Right. And I'll give you another quote to tell you, to remind people of the stature that Anna had. Andrew Kettle, who was one of the founders of the Irish Land League, described Anna as having a better knowledge of the social and political forces of Ireland than any person, man or woman, I have ever met. She would have worked the Land League revolution to a much better conclusion than her great brother. And that's why I say it's time to have Anna's body repatriated.
Well, Lucy, that has been a most interesting insight into the life of Anna Parnell. And as you're speaking, my sincere hope is that it will inspire a new generation of Irish people, and in particular Irish women, to take up the cudgel and to, I suppose, become activists in the cause of people who are now being evicted. because the cause today is every bit as great as it was.
It's as great now as it was then.
Yes.
She is an inspiration.
Yes. Lucy, it has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you so much. To those of you who have been watching, I want to thank you very much. And I invite you, please, to share this video so that we can get the story of Anna Parnell out to a much larger audience. Until we meet again, Bannock Day or Eve Galer.
Slán.